This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. I'm just as happy with this show being your nightly news show as I am with this show being background noise while you do whatever it is you're doing right now. Here's what we got for y'all. President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin finally sat down for a conversation months in the making. We'll tell you a bit about what came out of the talks and how that'll affect the rest of the world. But first, here's what you need to know right now. If you've been hoping for a summer trip abroad, you might want to get planning. Today, the European Union recommended that countries there start lifting restrictions on non-essential travel from the US. That's expected to be formalized by Friday.
We have been separated across the Atlantic for too long due to the pandemic.
Don't expect a cheap ticket though. Have you tried to book a flight recently? Prices are skyrocketing. Still, higher costs aren't stopping people from traveling. Take a look at TSA checkpoint screenings over the last week. They are way up from 2020. Last Friday, more than 2 million people were screened, making it closer to 2019 travel levels. And just as the cruise industry tries to sail again, one of the Royal Caribbean ships has hit some, well, rough waters. Not literally, but departure for the Odyssey of the Seas was delayed after 8 crew members tested positive for COVID. The ship is now scheduled to set sail at the end of this month. Travel was basically suspended around the world last year to try and limit the spread of COVID. As things get back to normal, it's pretty exciting, but there are lingering concerns about this Delta variant, which is spreading pretty viciously in some parts of the world. So don't be surprised if one of the requirements needed to travel abroad is proof of vaccination. The new president for the Southern Baptist Church has the potential to reshape the country's largest Protestant denomination. During the Southern Baptist Convention this week, Pastor Ed Litton, a moderate from Alabama, narrowly beat out Pastor Mike Stone, a more conservative candidate from Georgia. Stone was backed by a new group called the Conservative Baptist Network, which hoped to push the congregation further to the right. Newsy talked to a professor who studies religion and political science and says the congregation has come to mirror the divide we're currently seeing in politics.
It kind of shows you the fracturing that's going on in the American Republican Party, right? Between the MAGA Trump Republicans and sort of the old school like George W. Bush Republicans. And right now, the George W. Bush Republicans are barely holding on to power in the Southern Baptist Convention, but it's very conceivable that when they vote for a new president in 2 years, that it goes the other way. And the Southern Baptists will then become ultra conservative.
Some hot button topics that came up: critical race theory, which more conservative Baptists hope the convention would come out against. Instead, moderates passed a resolution to reaffirm the church's position on racial reconciliation, which the church sees as a form of healing that needs to happen to bring all races closer together. The convention also passed a resolution to publicly disqualify ministers who commit sexual abuse from holding pastoral positions. In recent years, there's been a shift in the church focusing more on those topics while moving away from cultural issues like gay marriage. The Department of Education plans to clear more than $500 million of student loan debt for borrowers who attended a for-profit college chain you may have seen commercials for throughout the 2000s.
ITT Technical Institute, education for the future.
The Education Department said ITT Technical Institute made repeated claims about the school's ability to help their students get jobs, but the reality was just the opposite. The school was eventually shut down in 2016 after being hit with financial sanctions from the Obama administration. The Biden White House approved loan forgiveness for 18,000 claims with this most recent move. Education Secretary Miguel Cardona has been on a campaign of sorts to offer full debt forgiveness to students who were defrauded by for-profit schools. Back in March, Cardona announced that the Education Department would clear debt for 72,000 borrowers, which could amount to $1 billion in loans. There's a backlog of claims because the repayment program stalled during the Trump administration. In Wednesday's announcement, Cardona said many borrowers have waited a long time for relief and that the administration is working to quickly address the backlog of claims. You may have had a few conversations today, but I'm guessing none of them were as high stakes as the chat between President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Just a guess. Ahead of the meeting, Biden consulted with other world leaders on how best to approach the talks. Now that they've wrapped up, Newsy's Luke Hanrahan is in London and unpacking the significance of that meeting for the rest of the world, especially European communities closest to the Russian border.
The leaders of two old foes taking tentative steps forward. And for the people living on the eastern fringes of Europe, what happened in Geneva today could eventually improve their lives. Violence in Ukraine has for years unsettled large swathes of Eastern Europe. But Wednesday, President Vladimir Putin was keen to spin a positive line. These were substantive, important, constructive talks, he stressed.
I communicated the United States' unwavering commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We agreed to pursue diplomacy related to the Minsk agreement.
And for President Joe Biden, the tangible possibility of a route out of a stalemate that has destabilized the globe.
By speaking to you, I already worry about my family in Russia.
Shielding his identity, Oliver has long opposed President Putin's regime, and outside the Russian embassy in London, he called for the West to take firmer action.
All that West need to do is to block all bank accounts and any assets of Russian oligarchs, and Putin will go.
His power will go.
Yeah, obviously, yeah.
Relations between the United States and Russia are at a low, littered with conflicts over the aggression in the Ukraine, cyber attacks, and alleged election interference. But here in Europe, the issues feel more palpable on the streets because simply, Europe is closer to Russia than America.
For those closest in proximity in countries like Latvia and Lithuania, people will be following every twist and turn of the American administration's progress. And for those on the Russian border in Ukraine, it could be the difference between war and peace.
The results of this summit will be felt most directly on the streets of Europe because it is Europe that is the scene of most of the contradictions between the United States and Russia that the two presidents are now working out. And that's especially the case in the frontline states, in those allies and partners of the United States that are also neighbors of Russia and which have been subject to this tug of war between the two sides, which is unresolved because Russia thinks it can constrain their sovereignty for its own security, whereas the West thinks that these are free, independent nations that should be able to choose their own future.
Today's meeting of presidents marks the beginning of a possible de-escalation of the battle fought in what is often called the grey zone, one of subversion and interference. Today a sign of possible progress, which for many is a result. For Newsy, I'm Luke Hanrahan in London.
U.S. police are retiring at a high rate, and many of those positions are going unfilled.